The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and it changed Jane Winslow's life in ways she never could have anticipated when she folded it into the breast pocket of her traveling coat and boarded the westbound train out of Philadelphia. She had been 26 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, and already something of a minor sensation in the photographic circles of the eastern seaboard. Her work had appeared in Harper's Weekly and in several issues of Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, landscapes mostly, a few portraits of factory workers and dock hands that had drawn both praise and controversy. But it was the frontier that called to her now, the wide and wild expanse of the American West that existed in her imagination as something mythic, something she had seen only in paintings and in the stilted daguerreotypes of men who had gone before her, and returned with flat, uninspired records of geography rather than portraits of a living, breathing world. The telegram had been from her editor at Frank Leslie's, a stout and perpetually ink-stained man named Horace Webb, who had written in his clipped, abbreviated style that she was to proceed to Colorado Territory, specifically to the mountain settlements outside a town called Ridgecrest, and document the frontier life for a series of illustrated features he intended to run through the summer and into the fall. The payment was generous. The expectations were vague. The freedom was extraordinary. Jane Winslow had packed her cameras, her glass plates, her chemicals, and 3 changes of clothing, and she had not looked back at Philadelphia once. The train ride took the better part of 2 weeks, with stops in Chicago and then in Kansas City, where she transferred to a smaller line that took her rattling and swaying through the brown grass of the plains and up into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. She sat with her forehead pressed to the window glass for most of that final stretch, watching the land transform beneath a vast and indifferent sky, the flatlands giving way to rolling ridges, and then to proper peaks that shredded the clouds and threw long purple shadows across the valleys below. She had never seen anything so enormous or so beautiful, and she spent 2 of her glass plates before the train had even stopped, hanging out the window with her camera braced against the door frame, trying to capture something that she was already beginning to understand could not truly be captured. It could only be witnessed. Ridgecrest was smaller than she had imagined. The main street was a single unpaved avenue lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, a telegraph office, a saloon that smelled of sawdust and whiskey even from the outside, a barber shop, and a modest hotel called the Continental that bore no resemblance to anything continental she had ever encountered, but which did have clean sheets, and a landlady named Mrs. Hargrove who looked at Jane's camera equipment with open suspicion before deciding, after a long and searching look at Jane herself, that she was probably not the sort of trouble she usually had to worry about. "You are here alone?" Mrs. Hargrove asked, not unkindly. "I am," Jane said, "to take photographs." "That is correct." Mrs. Hargrove considered this. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose the world is changing." It was, Jane thought, and she intended to document exactly how. She spent her first 3 days in Ridgecrest photographing the town itself, the men who loaded freight wagons outside the general store, the women who hung washing on lines strung between buildings, the children who ran barefoot in the dirt despite the chill that still clung to the mountain air in May. She photographed the saloon's proprietor, a weathered man named Cal Dobbins, who was missing 2 fingers on his left hand, and who told her the story of how he had lost them with such good humor that she laughed until her eyes watered. She photographed the blacksmith's forge, the sparks flying upward like orange stars against the dark interior of the workshop. She was thorough, she was professional, and she was beginning to feel, with annoying restlessness that she recognized as the particular dissatisfaction of an artist who knows she has not yet found the real subject, that she had not yet found what she had come here to see. It was on her 4th morning in Ridgecrest that she heard about Gideon Hunter. She was sitting at the long table in Mrs. Hargrove's dining room, eating salt pork and biscuits, and listening to the conversation of the two other guests, a traveling salesman from Denver named Aldrich and an older rancher named Beaumont, who was in town to purchase cattle, and who clearly regarded the salesman with profound contempt. They were arguing about something, some political matter that Jane was only half listening to, when the door to the hotel opened, and a man came in to speak quietly with Mrs. Hargrove, and the rancher Beaumont looked up and his expression shifted into something that was part respect and part wariness. "Gideon Hunter," Beaumont said, as though the name itself was worth saying aloud. Jane looked up. The man standing at the doorway talking to Mrs. Hargrove was unlike anyone Jane had encountered in Philadelphia or in the modest frontier towns she had passed through on her way west. He was enormous. That was her first impression, tall and broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke not of bulk, but of genuine physical power, the kind of strength that comes from years of hard labor in unforgiving country. His hair was dark brown and longer than the men in Philadelphia wore theirs, reaching past his collar and curling slightly at the ends, pushed back from his face in a way that suggested he had little patience for vanity, but also no particular interest in cutting it short. He wore a heavy canvas coat over a flannel shirt, buckskin trousers, and boots that had seen a great deal of terrain. His jaw was covered in several days of dark stubble, and when he turned slightly to gesture toward something outside, Jane could see that his forearms, where his sleeves were rolled back, were corded with muscle, his hands large and capable-looking, with the calluses and small scars of a man who worked with them constantly. He was, she thought with the detached professional assessment she applied to all potential subjects, extraordinary to look at. "Who is he?" she asked Beaumont. "Hunter." Beaumont looked at her with mild surprise as though the name should be self-explanatory. "Trapper mostly. Guides hunting parties up into the high country when the money suits him, which is not often because he does not care much for company. Lives up on the ridge, maybe 8 miles out of town. Come down maybe once a month for supplies. Man knows this mountain better than anyone alive." "He lives alone?" Jane asked. "As far as anyone knows," Beaumont said. "Man is a ghost up there. You see his smoke sometimes in winter, and you know he is still breathing, but otherwise he could vanish for months at a time, and you would never know." Jane watched as Gideon Hunter finished his business with Mrs. Hargrove, nodded once to the room in general without particularly looking at anyone, and walked back out into the morning sun. She watched him cross the street with an unhurried, ground-eating stride that spoke of a man accustomed to covering long distances on foot. She thought about the photographs she had taken so far, the town scenes, the ordinary life of an ordinary settlement. And she thought about what it would mean to document a man like that, a man who lived the old way, the frontier way, up in the high country that most people in Ridgecrest only looked at from a distance. She finished her breakfast, went upstairs to her room, and began organizing her equipment. It took her 2 more days to locate someone willing to guide her up the ridge road to the area where Gideon Hunter was said to keep his cabin. The man she finally convinced was a young wrangler named Pete Alcott, who worked at the livery stable, and who agreed to escort her as far as the lower ridge in exchange for $2, which he accepted with barely concealed amazement, clearly having expected to negotiate harder. He could not take her all the way to Hunter's land, Pete explained, because Hunter did not particularly welcome visitors and Pete had no particular desire to find out what Hunter did with visitors he did not welcome. "He is dangerous?" Jane asked, studying Pete's face for the true shape of his concern. "No," Pete said slowly. "Not exactly. He is very serious. He does not smile much, and he is very large." He paused. "Mostly I just do not want to bother him." Jane packed her camera, her tripod, a satchel of glass plates, and her chemicals into the rented wagon, and let Pete Alcott drive her up the ridge road at first light on a Thursday morning in mid-May, with the sun coming up behind the eastern peaks and turning the sky above Ridgecrest into a wash of gold and rose that made her reach for her camera even before they had left the edge of town. The road up the ridge was barely a road at all, more of a track, two parallel ruts in the earth that wound upward through stands of ponderosa pine and aspen, across creek crossings that set the wagon wheels rattling, and along exposed hillsides where the drop was steep enough to make her grip the wagon seat with both hands. The morning was cold despite the season, the air tasting of pine resin and snowmelt and something clean and ancient that she had no name for. She breathed it in deeply and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. Pete stopped the wagon at a fork in the track where a weathered wooden post bore no markings at all. He pointed up the left fork toward a tree line that grew thicker and darker as the slope steepened. "His cabin is up that way, maybe a mile or two," Pete said. He was already turning the wagon. "I will come back for you this evening before dark." "And if I am not at this spot?" Jane asked, climbing down with her equipment. "Then I will assume you have been adopted by the wilderness," Pete said, with a grin that suggested he was not entirely joking, "and I will tell Mrs. Hargrove to rent your room." She laughed, adjusted the strap of her satchel, gripped her tripod under her arm and started up the left fork. The mile or two that Pete had estimated turned out to be closer to 3, and the track became less distinct with every 100 yards, until she was navigating more by logic than by any visible path, following the line of least resistance through the trees, keeping the slope in a consistent relationship to her left shoulder. The forest was extraordinary, enormous trees with bark the color of rust and cinnamon, their canopy filtering the morning sun into long shafts of light that angled down through the needles and illuminated the forest floor in patches. She stopped 3 times to set up her camera and photograph the light, the bark, the way the trees grew up from the rocky soil with such patient, permanent insistence. She was crouching over her camera case, replacing a used glass plate with a fresh one, when she heard the sound. It was a low sound, soft but definite, somewhere to her right in the thicker trees, and it stopped her hands instantly. She straightened slowly and turned to look, and there between 2 large boulders maybe 30 feet away, a mountain lion stood watching her with yellow eyes that held no fear whatsoever and a great deal of cool, predatory interest. Jane Winslow did not scream. She would be proud of this later. What she did was stand very still, her heart hammering with sudden violence against her ribs, and try to remember everything she had ever heard about mountain lions, which at that moment amounted to almost nothing useful. She did not have to remember for long. A sharp, carrying whistle cut through the morning air from somewhere up the slope, 2 notes, descending, the kind of sound that carries authority. The mountain lion's gaze moved away from Jane, up the slope, and then the animal turned without hurry and disappeared into the trees as smoothly and completely as smoke. Jane let out a slow, controlled breath. "You should not be here." The voice came from her left, and she turned to find Gideon Hunter standing on a flat-topped boulder about 15 feet away, looking down at her with an expression that was not hostile, but was absolutely not welcoming either. Up close, in the open forest light rather than across a hotel dining room, he was even more striking than she remembered. He was carrying a rifle in the crook of his left arm with the ease of a man who carries rifles the way other men carry umbrellas. His dark hair was pushed back from his face, and his eyes, she could see now, were a particular shade of gray-green that reminded her of deep water, watchful and still. "You are Gideon Hunter," she said, because she did not have a better opening. "I am," he said, "and you are the photographer from the east who has been pointing her camera at my town for the past 4 days. It was not a question. He had clearly known she was here before she had come looking for him, which was somehow both unsettling and impressive. "Jane Winslow," she said. "I work for Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. I am documenting frontier life for a series of features." She paused. "I was hoping to photograph you." Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement but adjacent to it. "Were you?" "Yes," she said. "You and the high country, the way you live up here." She gestured with one hand at the forest around them, which felt faintly absurd given that it was the single largest thing in her field of vision in every direction. The old way of doing things before all of it changes, because it will change sooner than people think. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those gray-green eyes in a way that made her feel examined but not judged, as though he was assessing a piece of terrain rather than finding fault with it. "You are brave," he said finally, "or foolish to come up here alone." "Pete Alcott drove me to the fork," she said. "Pete Alcott is 17 and was too frightened to come any further," Gideon said. "So you walked 3 miles alone through country with mountain lions in it to ask a man you have never met if he will sit for a photograph." When he put it that way, Jane could see his point. "Yes," she said, "that is essentially what I did." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he climbed down from the boulder with an easy, controlled movement that spoke of a man comfortable with heights and unstable surfaces, and he held out one hand. "Come on, then," he said. "You can see the cabin before I decide whether to let you photograph anything." She picked up her equipment and followed him up the slope. The cabin sat in a clearing near the crest of the ridge, positioned to catch the morning light and sheltered from the worst of the winter wind by a natural windbreak of boulders on the north side. It was built from logs that had been carefully fitted and chinked, tight and solid, with a covered porch that ran along the front and a stone chimney from which a thin thread of smoke was rising into the clear blue sky. Behind the cabin, a small barn and a corral held 2 horses, a sturdy gray and a darker roan, and off to one side was a smokehouse and a woodpile that was stacked with a neatness that surprised her. She had expected something rougher, more provisional. This was a home, genuinely and carefully made. Gideon Hunter held the cabin door open for her, and she stepped inside. The interior was one large room, a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a heavy plank table in the center, 2 chairs, a rope bed in the corner covered with a wool blanket, shelves along one wall holding supplies arranged with the same precise neatness as the woodpile outside. Hung on the walls were traps and tools, a second rifle, and to her surprise, 2 pencil drawings tacked to the logs near the fireplace, one of the mountain vista as seen from the ridge top, and one of what appeared to be a hawk in flight, both rendered with a skill that startled her. "Did you draw those?" she asked. He was putting a coffee pot on the iron hook over the fire, his back to her. "Yes. They are very good," she said, meaning it. He glanced over his shoulder at her with that almost but not quite expression again. "Coffee, please," she said, and set her equipment down carefully against the wall. They sat at the table and drank coffee that was strong enough to strip paint, and Jane talked while Gideon Hunter mostly listened, which she found, after the first few minutes of adjusting her expectations, to be a perfectly satisfying form of conversation. She explained the newspaper's commission, the series she was documenting, the kind of photographs she wanted to take. She talked about her work in Philadelphia, about the technical process of the wet collodion plates she used, the equipment she carried, the challenges of photographing outdoors in changing light. He asked occasional, precise questions that told her he was paying close attention to everything she said, even while his face remained largely still. "Why the frontier?" he asked at one point. "You could photograph things in the East. Why come all this way?" She turned her coffee cup in her hands, thinking about how to answer honestly. "Because it is real here," she said finally. "Or it is a different kind of real. In Philadelphia, everything is already mediated. There are layers of civilization between you and the actual land, between you and genuine living. Out here, things are closer to the surface. You can see the bones of things." She paused. "I want to photograph the bones." Gideon Hunter looked at her steadily across the table. "That is an interesting way to put it," he said. "Is it accurate?" she asked. He thought about that for a moment with his characteristic unhurried patience. "Yes," he said, "it is." He let her photograph the cabin's exterior that afternoon, and then the view from the ridge top, which was staggering, an unbroken panorama of mountain peaks and forested valleys, and in the far distance, the brown smudge of lower country that eventually opened into the plains. She worked for 3 hours, moving her camera and tripod to a dozen different positions, burning through 6 glass plates, utterly absorbed. Gideon Hunter watched her work with an expression she could not quite read, leaning against a boulder with his rifle across his knees, saying nothing but making her feel neither hurried nor scrutinized. He simply watched, with the patient attention he seemed to bring to everything. When Pete Alcott's whistle reached them from somewhere down the slope, indicating that he had returned to the fork, she packed her equipment with genuine reluctance. "May I come back?" she asked. Gideon Hunter picked up her camera case and carried it down the first steep part of the slope without being asked. "Yes," he said, in a tone that suggested this had not been an easy decision. She came back the next day, and the day after that, and within a week she had established a routine that involved Pete Alcott dropping her at the fork every morning and collecting her every evening, while she spent the daylight hours on the ridge in Gideon Hunter's vicinity, photographing the country and occasionally, increasingly, photographing him. He was, she discovered quickly, an extraordinarily difficult subject in one specific way. He did not perform for the camera. Most people, when they became aware that a photograph was being taken of them, changed. They stiffened, they posed, they put on an expression that was not quite their own. Gideon Hunter did not do this. He either ignored the camera entirely, or regarded it with the same frank, direct attention he gave to everything else. And the result was photographs that had a quality she had never quite achieved before. An absolute, unself-conscious presence that seemed to reach through the glass and grab the viewer by the collar. She photographed him splitting firewood, the axe swinging with smooth mechanical efficiency, his shirt darkening with exertion in the morning sun, the muscles in his back and shoulders moving under the fabric with every strike. She photographed him at the creek, crouching to check a trap line with intense focused attention. She photographed him standing at the ridge top looking out at the mountains with his rifle at his back, his hair lifting slightly in the constant wind, his silhouette against that impossible sky. Each photograph was better than the last, and she knew it, and the knowing created a particular quality of excitement that was getting harder to attribute entirely to professional satisfaction. They talked every day, over coffee in the morning, and again over whatever meal he had prepared by the time the afternoon light began to go. He was not a voluble man, but he was not a silent one either. He spoke when he had something worth saying, and what he said was almost always worth hearing. He knew the mountain with the intimacy of a man who had lived on it for years, knew its weather patterns and its wildlife, its seasonal rhythms and its particular dangers. He had come to Colorado from Kentucky 10 years before. He told her one afternoon, when she asked him directly, heading west after a few years of prospecting in the goldfields, proved to him that he was not a man suited to crowds or to the particular frenzy that gold brought out in people. He had stumbled on this ridge purely by accident on a hunting trip and had recognized it immediately as the place he was going to stay. "Did you have family?" she asked. "People who missed you when you left Kentucky?" A pause. "My parents both died when I was 19, he said. "Fever, 2 winters apart. I had no brothers or sisters." He said this without self-pity, simply stating facts. "I am not particularly well suited to missing or being missed. I do better with the mountain." She looked at him across the fire, the evening light catching the strong line of his jaw and the steady quality of his eyes. "I think," she said carefully, "that you might be better at being missed than you realize." He looked at her with an expression that was unreadable in a way she was beginning to recognize as him processing something he had not expected. And then he looked back at the fire without answering. She told him about her own life in return, about growing up in Philadelphia with a father who was a newspaper editor and a mother who had died when Jane was 12, about learning photography from a family friend who had a studio on Chestnut Street, and who had recognized something in her eye that he called the gift of seeing, about the years of building a career in a field that regarded women with mostly polite condescension and occasionally something less polite, about the determination that she had always assumed was simply her nature, but which she sometimes, in honest moments, recognized as a form of armor. "You are not afraid of much," Gideon said one afternoon. It was not quite a compliment and not quite an observation, somewhere in between. "I am afraid of plenty of things," she said. "I have just decided that being afraid of them is less interesting than doing them anyway." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, quiet and low, and she found herself inordinately pleased by it, the way a person is pleased when they finally manage to coax a rare bird into the open. She photographed him on the 12th day as he stood at the edge of the clearing, watching a pair of eagles ride the thermals above the ridge. She had set up her camera without him noticing, working quickly and quietly the way she had learned to work when she wanted to catch something real before the awareness of the camera changed it. The morning light was perfect, cutting across from the east and catching him in profile, his broad shoulders relaxed, his head tilted slightly upward, his hair lifted by the wind. He was completely still in the way that only certain people can be completely still, a quality of absolute presentness that the camera loved. She slid the plate holder into place and squeezed the rubber bulb release, and the shutter snapped, and she knew before she developed the plate that it was the best photograph she had ever taken. She developed it that evening in the makeshift darkroom she had set up in the small storage room of the Continental Hotel, working by the dim red light of her lantern, watching the image come up in the developing bath with a feeling in her chest that was not entirely professional. He was extraordinary in the image. The mountains were in the distance behind him, enormous and indifferent, and he stood in the foreground with the kind of presence that made the mountains look, for once, like background rather than subject. He was looking upward at something out of the frame, and his expression was open in a way she had not managed to capture before, soft around the edges in a way his face rarely was when he was conscious of being observed. She stared at the photograph for a long time before she pinned it up to dry. She admitted to herself in the quiet of that red-lit room, thinking about Gideon Hunter in ways that had nothing to do with photography. On the 15th day, there was a problem. She had set out up the Ridge Road on her own that morning, because Pete Alcott had sent word that he was needed at the livery for a large incoming freight delivery, and could not drive her. She had decided to walk, which was farther than she liked but which she was capable of, and she had been doing well until the spring storm that had been building in the west all morning broke with sudden violence about halfway up the track, turning the sky dark green and sending sheets of rain sweeping across the ridge. The track became a river in minutes, and Jane pressed on with her head down and her equipment wrapped in the oilcloth she had learned to carry, but the cold was more serious than the rain. It was May, but in the mountains May could still deliver a genuine chill, and she was wet through before she had gone another quarter mile. She was still 2 miles from the cabin when she heard hoofbeats behind her, and then Gideon Hunter was pulling his gray horse up beside her on the track, his face taut with something that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it, the particular expression of a person who has been worried and is expressing that worry as irritation. "Get on," he said. "I can walk," she said, through teeth that were beginning to chatter despite herself. "Jane," he said, and something about the way he said her name, direct and certain, as though he had decided he was going to use it and that was simply what was going to happen, stopped her argument before it finished forming. He reached down and she took his hand, and he lifted her up onto the horse behind him with a strength that was staggering, as though she weighed nothing at all, and she grabbed his coat to keep her balance and he urged the horse forward. She rode with her arms around him and her face against his back, feeling the warmth of him through the wet canvas of his coat, and she thought about how completely ridiculous she had been to walk up a mountain in an approaching storm. And she thought also about how the feel of his back against her cheek was the most purely comfortable thing she had experienced in months, and she was too cold and too grateful to be embarrassed by either thought. He got her into the cabin and had a fire roaring within 10 minutes, and he put a blanket around her shoulders and pressed a cup of hot coffee into her hands and stood near the fireplace with his arms crossed and his expression still in that somewhere between worry and irritation territory. "You should have waited," he said. "I did not want to miss the morning light," she said. He looked at her with exasperation that was clearly fighting with something else. "The morning light," he repeated. "It is exceptional right now, with the storm building in the west. The quality of the light before the rain comes is extraordinary. That green quality," she stopped, because something about his expression had changed, the irritation losing its fight with the something else, which she was beginning to identify as a kind of helpless, reluctant warmth that she found completely devastating. "I know," she said more quietly. "I should have waited." He pulled the second chair close to the fire and sat in it, forearms on his knees, close enough that she could see the water still beating on his coat. "You could have been caught out in that in full force," he said. "At that elevation in this weather, that is serious." "I know," she said again. "Thank you for coming for me." He looked at her for a moment with those steady gray-green eyes. "I saw the storm building," he said, as though this explained why he had come down the ridge in the rain to find her, which it partially did, but she was fairly certain it did not entirely. They stayed inside that day while the storm moved over the mountain, listening to the rain on the roof and the wind against the logs, and they talked for hours, the longest and most continuous conversation they had had yet. He told her about the winters on the ridge, the months of deep snow when the world contracted to the cabin and the barn and the woodpile, when he read whatever books he had been able to carry up from town and redrew his maps of the surrounding country from memory, checking them against reality in spring. He told her about a winter 3 years ago when he had been caught in a blizzard 2 days from the cabin and had survived by digging into a snowbank and sleeping inside it, which she found simultaneously horrifying and completely characteristic of him. He told her about the mountain lion she had encountered, a female with a territory that overlapped with the eastern edge of his, which he had gradually accustomed to his presence over 2 years, so that they now coexisted in a kind of mutual armed respect. She told him about her photographs, about what she intended to do with them, about the series she was building, and how she was beginning to feel that the work she was doing up on the ridge was the best work she had ever done, and that she did not know entirely what to do with that realization because it meant she did not want to stop. "Then do not stop," he said simply. She looked at him. "I have a deadline," she said. "And a life in Philadelphia." He held her gaze. "Do you want to go back to Philadelphia?" The honest answer to that question surprised her when it arrived fully formed in her mind, and she did not speak it aloud because she was not yet ready to, but she thought that something of it must have shown in her face because his eyes shifted very slightly, and something quiet and serious moved through his expression. "The storm is letting up," he said after a moment. It was, the rain softening on the roof. But neither of them moved toward the door. She started walking up herself from the second week onward, having borrowed a decent horse from Pete's livery stable, which halved the journey time and gave her the freedom to leave when the light suited her rather than when Pete could drive her. She tied the horse at the bottom of the ridge path and walked the last mile, which she had come to genuinely look forward to, that upward mile through the pines where the air changed and the sounds of the lower world fell away. Gideon began to expect her. She could tell because on the morning she arrived he already had the coffee made, and on the one morning she did not come, having stayed in town to develop a batch of plates and write her dispatch to Horace Webb. She learned the next day that he had come down the ridge to the fork and waited there for an hour before going back up. He told her this with no particular emphasis, as a simple fact, and she felt something shift warmly in her chest and did not quite look at him directly for several minutes afterward. She was photographing him at the corral one afternoon, 3 weeks into her time on the ridge, when she stopped looking through the viewfinder and simply looked at him instead. He was working with the roan horse, running his hand along its neck with a gentleness that consistently surprised her in a man who looked the way he looked, all that contained power and physical certainty, and yet could touch an animal with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world. His sleeves were rolled back and she could see the muscles of his forearms, the scarred hands moving softly over the horse's coat, and his face in profile was open and focused and beautiful, she thought, in the specific way that genuine engagement with something is always beautiful. She set the camera down. He noticed the absence of the shutter sound and glanced over at her, and she was standing there with her arms at her sides looking at him, not reaching for the camera, just looking, and something in the quality of her looking must have communicated itself clearly because he was very still for a moment, and then he came to the fence and leaned on the top rail and looked back at her with the same quality of attention. "Jane," he said. "Yes," she said. "You are looking at me different," he said. She thought about deflecting. She was good at deflecting, had spent years becoming skilled at it. "I know," she said instead. His jaw tightened slightly, a muscle working, and she recognized it as the look of a man saying something careful. "I do not want to be misled about what that means," he said. "I am not a man who is good at being misled." "I am not misleading you," she said quietly. "I am working out how honest to be." He waited. That was one of his gifts. She had learned the ability to wait without pressure, giving space for things to arrive in their own time. "I do not want to leave," she said. "When I think about going back to Philadelphia, it feels wrong in a way that it did not feel before I came up here." She paused. "Before I met you." He looked at her for a long, serious moment. "I have been alone on this ridge for a long time," he said. "I know how to be alone. I am good at it." A pause. "I am finding that I do not want to be the way I did before." She stepped forward and put both her hands on the fence rail, close to his, and looked up at him. And he looked down at her, and the space between them was full of everything that had been accumulating over 3 weeks of morning coffee and ridgetop silences and shared conversations beside the fire. He reached up and tucked a strand of her hair back that the wind had displaced, a gesture so careful and deliberate that it made her breath catch, and his fingers lingered for a moment at the side of her face. "I do not know what I am doing," he said honestly. "I am not practiced at this." "Neither am I," she said. "Not at this particular version of it." He leaned down and kissed her, gentle at first and then less so, and she put her hands on the front of his coat and held on, and the roan horse moved peacefully in the corral behind them, and the wind moved through the pines, and the mountains stood in their permanent, gorgeous indifference above it all. When they pulled apart, his forehead came to rest against hers, and they stood there breathing. "That complicates things," he said. "Only if you want to uncomplicate them," she said. He made that low, quiet sound that was almost a laugh. "I do not," he said. She went back to Ridgecrest that evening with her heart in a state she had no precise category for, something between exhilaration and terror, and a deep, settled certainty that was the most unfamiliar of the three. She sat at the writing desk in her hotel room and tried to compose her second dispatch to Horace Webb, and found she could not concentrate, her mind returning instead to the feeling of Gideon Hunter's hands on her face and the way he had looked at her when she had said she did not want to leave. She was not a woman who made decisions based on feeling alone, she told herself. She was organized and rational, and she knew the shape of her life in Philadelphia, its routines and satisfactions, and the career she had built with considerable effort. She also knew, sitting in the Continental Hotel's modest room with the mountains visible through her window, that she had never once in Philadelphia felt the way she felt when she was on that ridge, which was as though the world had dimensions she had not previously known existed. She wrote a shorter dispatch than usual and went to sleep and dreamed of eagles riding thermals over a ridge. She went back up the next morning. In the weeks that followed, things deepened between them with the same quality of inevitability that the best things in life have, the sense not of rushing forward but of arriving somewhere that was already there. They did not have the language for grand declarations, neither of them. What they had instead was the accumulation of small, precise truths, the way he always knew when she needed more light for a shot, and positioned himself without being asked. The way she had learned to read the particular silence that meant he was bothered by something versus the silence that meant he was simply at peace. The coffee that was always ready. The evenings that stretched later and later before she rode back down the ridge in the fading light with her heart full. He took her deeper into the high country one morning in mid-June, up above the tree line and onto the open tundra where the wind was constant, and the view was so vast it made her feel simultaneously enormous and insignificant, both sensations being ones she was beginning to appreciate. He had his pack and his rifle and she had her camera, and they climbed for hours before breaking out above the trees into the alpine meadows, where the late-season wildflowers were coming up in patches of yellow and blue and white between the rocks. She photographed everything. The alpine meadows, the views, the way the clouds built and broke over the distant peaks. And she photographed him, of course, at altitude, with the full sweep of the Colorado Rockies behind him and the sky enormous above. And every photograph was better than the last because he was more himself now, more relaxed in her presence, the watchfulness still there but the wariness gone, and the camera caught the difference. "I want to show you something," he said in the afternoon, and he led her along a high rocky traverse to a sheltered bowl on the eastern face where a small lake sat in perfect stillness, mirror still and impossibly blue-green, reflecting the sky and the peaks above in perfect detail. There were no trees here, just the rock and the water and the sky, and the silence was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat. "I have never brought anyone here," he said. She looked at him. "Why me?" He thought about that for a moment with his characteristic unhurried seriousness. "Because you see things," he said. "You know how to look at something without needing to own it or explain it or make it into something else." He paused. "Most people do not know how to do that." She turned to look at the lake and then back at him and said, "Neither do I always, but I am getting better." He smiled then, properly smiled, a rare and transformative thing, and she thought she might love him, a thought that arrived so plainly and with so little fanfare that it seemed it must have been there for some time, waiting to be acknowledged. She wrote to Horace Webb that week and told him she was extending her stay. He wrote back, as she had gambled he would, expressing enthusiasm at the quality of her dispatches and photographs, which had apparently caused considerable excitement in the editorial offices, and telling her to stay as long as she needed. She sent him 4 photographs in that packet. The best one was the silhouette against the sky. There was a complication in July. It came in the form of 2 men from Denver, associates of a mining concern called the Ryland Mining Company, who arrived in Ridgecrest and began making inquiries about the ridge, specifically about mining claims in the high country, and about the availability of certain parcels of land that were, according to the county clerk, not formally titled to anyone. The parcel on which Gideon Hunter had built his cabin and lived for the past 10 years was among them. Jane heard about this from Mrs. Hargrove, who heard it from the telegraph operator, who had processed the initial inquiries. She rode up the ridge the following morning with the news and found Gideon splitting wood in the early light, working with the methodical efficiency he brought to all physical tasks, and she told him what she had heard while he set the axe in the chopping block and listened with an expression that went through several changes she could track, from stillness to a flicker of something sharp to a settled, determined calm. "Ryland," he said. "You know them." "I know of them. They have been buying up land east of the divide for 2 years. He was quiet for a moment. "There is copper on the north slope above the tree line. I have known it was there. I did not think anyone else knew." "If the land is not titled," she began. "It is not titled because the county does not have clear records for the upper ridge," he said. "I should have filed a homestead claim years ago." He said this without self-recrimination, as a practical observation about a practical problem which she found admirable. "Then file one now," she said. "Is there a land office?" "In Ridgecrest. I have used it twice before for lower parcels." He looked at her steadily. "You know about land claims?" "My father was a newspaper editor who covered politics and law," she said. I know enough. She paused. Come down with me tomorrow, file the claim. He hesitated, and she recognized the hesitation. A man who had spent 10 years solving his problems on the mountain, alone, who was not practiced in the specific social navigation required to interact with legal offices and territorial bureaucracies. I will come with you, she said. Two people together look more serious than one. The look he gave her then was not the one she had been expecting. Not gratitude exactly, but something more complex. The look of a man realizing that being offered genuine help by someone who had no obligation to offer it is a specific and somewhat overwhelming kind of gift. All right, he said. They rode down together the next morning, Gideon on his gray horse and Jane on her borrowed roan, and they went to the county land office where a bespectacled clerk named Morton processed Gideon's homestead claim with officious thoroughness and issued him a receipt that he could use while the formal paperwork moved through the territorial system. Jane helped draft the description of the parcel boundaries, drawing on his detailed knowledge of the terrain, and the claim was filed to include not only the cabin and surrounding acreage but the north slope where the copper veins ran. When the two men from the Ryland Mining Company came to the land office that same afternoon, as Morton told Jane when she stopped back in, they found the claim already filed, and Morris turned them away with the law clearly behind him. Gideon heard the outcome from Jane when she rode back up to the ridge that evening. He was quiet for a long moment after she told him. Thank you, he said, and the simplicity of it from him carried more weight than an elaborate expression would have. You are welcome, she said. And then, because she was Jane Winslow and she had decided not to be less than honest with this man, I had very selfish reasons as well. I did not want you to have to leave this ridge. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes in the long summer evening light. No, he said. Neither did I. They watched the sunset from the ridge top that night, sitting close together on the flat-topped boulder where he had stood on the first morning she had encountered him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and neither of them said anything about the future. But the future was there between them, solid and warm, waiting to be addressed. In August, Jane's editor Horace Webb arrived in person. She had not expected this. He came on the train from Denver with two of his editorial assistants and a general air of a man who has been sitting at a desk too long and is alarmed by his own enthusiasm. He came to the hotel and met Jane in the dining room and spread the photographs she had been sending him across the table with an expression she recognized from years of working with him. The expression of a man who is trying to contain excitement and is not quite succeeding. These are extraordinary, he said, for what she estimated was the fifth time. He kept returning to the silhouette photograph, the one of Gideon against the sky. Who is this man? His name is Gideon Hunter, she said. He has lived on that ridge for 10 years. He is remarkable in the photograph, Webb said. He is remarkable in all of them. Does he know you have been photographing him? He does, she said. He consented. I want to do a special feature, Webb said, leaning forward. Not just frontier life generally. I want to do a feature specifically on him, on his way of living up there, on what that life actually looks like before it disappears. The photographs support it completely. This is the frontier, Jane. This is what people in New York and Philadelphia and Boston have never seen. This is the real thing. She thought about Gideon Hunter, about his cabin and his mountain and the way he looked at eagles. I will need to ask him, she said. Webb blinked. Of course. I only mean it would be significant, a major feature, your name on it, his photograph on the cover. She rode up the ridge the next morning and told Gideon about the editor's visit and the proposed feature. He listened with his characteristic stillness. A cover photograph, he said. Yes. He was quiet. People would see it. A great many people, she said honestly. It is a national publication. He turned to look at the mountains for a moment. Is this what you want, he asked, for your work? He considered the question seriously, as he deserved. Yes, she said. It is very good work, some of the best I have done, but I want it to be what you want as well, or at least something you are comfortable with. If you say no, I will tell Horace Webb that the subject was not available. He turned back to her. And if I say yes, then I will spend another 2 weeks here documenting everything more thoroughly, and then I will go back to Philadelphia to prepare the feature, and then it will run. She paused, and I will be in Philadelphia. He held her gaze for a long moment with an expression she could not entirely read and did not try to, knowing he was working through something and that working through it needed space. Yes, he said finally. You can do the feature. She nodded. Thank you. Jane. He said her name the way he had learned to say it with weight. What happens after Philadelphia? She had been thinking about this since the night on the boulder watching the sunset. She had been thinking about it with a clarity that still surprised her, given that she had spent her whole adult life understanding herself to be a city person, an East Coast person, a person whose world was made of print and professional ambition. I think I come back, she said. He looked at her carefully. You think? I know, she said more quietly. I just said think because knowing feels like a large thing to say out loud. He closed the distance between them and put his hands on either side of her face and tilted it up toward him and looked at her with something in his expression that was unguarded in a way she had never seen from him before. All of the watchfulness gone, just him, just Gideon, looking at her as though she was something he could not quite believe was real. Do not come back unless you are certain, he said. This is not a life for someone who is almost certain. I am certain, she said. I am frightened and I am uncertain about the logistics and I do not know how any of it works, but I am certain about you, about us. She paused. I have been certain about you since the morning you whistled the mountain lion away. He made that low sound that was his version of a laugh, and then he kissed her with a completeness that was its own kind of answer. She spent 2 more weeks on the ridge, the most intensive period of work she had done yet, photographing everything with a thoroughness that came from knowing she was building something that needed to last. She photographed the traps and the smokehouse and the corral and the horses and the cabin in every light from dawn to dusk. She photographed him at the creek and on the ridge and in the forest and at the fire. She photographed the view from the Alpine Lake in the bowl on the eastern face, carrying her equipment up there on a clear August morning when the water was so still it reflected every cloud. She photographed him looking at that lake with the expression he had on his face when he had told her he had never brought anyone here before, and she thought that photograph might be the truest one she had taken of him yet. On her last evening on the ridge, they sat on the porch of his cabin and watched the dark come down over the mountains, and he held her hand in both of his with the careful deliberateness he brought to everything, and they talked about the future with more practicality than poetry, which suited them both. I will be gone perhaps 2 months, she said, to prepare the feature and settle things in Philadelphia. I know, he said. I will write, she said. I will come to town for the post, he said, which she knew was a significant commitment from a man who came to town once a month on a good month. She looked at him. When I come back, I want to stay. Yes, he said simply. Permanently, she said. Yes, Jane, he said with patient warmth. I understand. I want to make sure we are saying the same thing, she said. He turned to look at her with a small, real smile. We are saying the same thing. She left Ridgecrest on a bright September morning with Horace Webb and his assistants, her camera equipment packed into the wagon Webb had hired, and she turned once to look up at the ridge before the wagon rounded the curve out of town, and she could see, if she was not imagining it, a dark speck on the ridge line that might have been a man standing at the edge of the tree line, watching the wagon go. She turned back to face the road, and she did not let herself feel what she was feeling. Not yet, because feeling it fully would make it harder to do what needed to be done, which was to go to Philadelphia and do her work and come back. Philadelphia was both familiar and strange after the months in Colorado. The streets were noisy and the air was thick, and the people moved with the particular urgent velocity of people who are always in a hurry and could not explain why. She settled back into her routine with a professional efficiency that impressed Webb and satisfied her editors. But she was aware, constantly and with a specificity that was new, of being in the wrong place. The feature ran in October. Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper devoted 6 pages to it, with Jane's photographs reproduced in the best quality the printing process could manage, and the silhouette photograph of Gideon Hunter against the Colorado sky on the cover. The headline read "Life on the High Frontier," and the text, which Jane had written herself, was the best writing she had done for the paper, precise and unsentimental and honest in the way that Gideon himself had taught her honesty could be. The response was extraordinary. Letters flooded the editorial offices from across the country, from people who had never seen the West and who found in those photographs something they could not name but clearly needed to see. Webb told her, with barely contained excitement, that the feature was the most discussed thing they had published in 3 years. He wanted a sequel. He wanted a series. He had ideas about book publication, about an exhibit of the original prints in the New York galleries. Jane sat across from him in his office and listened to all of it, and then she said, "I will continue the work from Colorado." He stared at her. "You mean another visit?" "I mean I intend to move there," she said. "I can send the photographs and the dispatches. The mail is perfectly adequate. I do not need to be in Philadelphia to do this work. In fact, I cannot do this work in Philadelphia." He argued with her for 20 minutes, efficiently and with real feeling, and she heard him out with genuine respect, because she had always liked Horace Webb and she understood that he was not wrong from his perspective. And then she told him again that she was going to Colorado. "This is about the mountain man," Webb said finally, not unkindly. "His name is Gideon Hunter," she said. "And yes, partly, but it is also about the work. They are not separate things." Webb looked at her for a long moment. "The photographs really are extraordinary," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He sighed. "Well," he said, "if you continue to send me work of this quality, I suppose I can manage to not have you in this office." She was on the westbound train 3 weeks later, on a November morning with frost on the windows and the Philadelphia skyline shrinking behind her. She had settled her apartment, arranged her affairs, written to her few close friends, and packed everything that mattered to her into 3 trunks, which included her photographic equipment, her books, and the set of silver-backed hairbrushes that had been her mother's. She had also written to Gideon 2 letters in the time she had been in Philadelphia, telling him of the feature's reception and of her plans, and he had written back 2 letters in his careful, sparse hand, the kind of letters a man writes when he is not practiced at letters but is determined to try, which were consequently among the most moving things she had read. The second one had said, at its end, "The mountain is different when you are not on it. I am told this is what missing someone feels like." I had forgotten. She read it 3 times on the train west and then folded it into the breast pocket of her coat, next to her heart, which was where it stayed for the entire journey. She arrived in Ridgecrest on a gray afternoon in late November, stepping off the wagon from the train station at Denver into the cold Main Street with her trunks and her equipment, and she looked up the ridge before she even looked for the hotel, as though checking that it was still there, which it was, enormous and white-capped with early snow and absolutely itself. Mrs. Hargrove met her on the hotel steps. "I had word you were coming," the landlady said, with a warmth that was considerably more pronounced than the measured neutrality of their first meeting. "He came down yesterday to ask if I had seen the Denver coach." Jane smiled. "Is he in town?" "He went back up this morning when the coach was delayed," Mrs. Hargrove said, "but he will know by evening that it came today." She was right. Jane was unpacking in her room when she heard a horse in the street below and went to her window and looked down, and Gideon Hunter was tying his gray horse at the rail below, moving with that ground-eating stride she had spent months watching, and he looked up at the hotel windows as though he had known exactly which one to look at. She was downstairs in 2 minutes. He was in the doorway, his hat in his hand for once, his dark hair wind-blown from the ride down, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her that last afternoon on the porch, with all the watchfulness gone, just him, just that unguarded directness that she had come to understand was the highest compliment he was capable of paying anyone. "You came back," he said. "I told you I would," she said. "I know," he said. I believed you. A pause. It is different knowing and seeing. She crossed the room and he put his arms around her and she pressed her face to his chest, breathing in the pine and cold air smell of him, and his chin came to rest on top of her head, and she felt the specific quality of rightness that had been absent from Philadelphia for 2 months settle back around her like a blanket. He held her for a long time in Mrs. Hargrove's hotel doorway while the November wind moved through the empty street. The winter on the ridge was hard and extraordinary and everything she had imagined it might be, and also nothing like what she had imagined, which she had expected. She had moved into the cabin in December, after Gideon had ridden down to town to speak with the local minister, a gentle and somewhat surprised man named Reverend Coulter, and they had been married in the Continental Hotel's small sitting room on a Thursday afternoon with Mrs. Hargrove and Pete Alcott and the Beaumont rancher as witnesses. It was not a grand ceremony. Gideon wore his best shirt, and she wore her second-best dress, and Reverend Coulter read the relevant words from his book, and they said the relevant words back to him. And when it was done, Gideon Hunter looked at her with an expression that she had never quite seen on him before, something that combined the directness and the warmth in something new, a kind of grounded and complete seriousness, as though he had just made the most important decision of his life and was at absolute peace with it. She photographed him the next morning on the porch of the cabin with the snow-covered ridge behind him and the winter light going gold across the peaks, and the photograph she developed afterward was the one she would always consider the finest of her career, not because of the composition or the light, though both were excellent, but because of what was in his face. A man entirely in his own life, entirely at home in it, entirely unafraid. She sent copies of the winter photographs to Horace Webb, who wrote back in a state of undisguised enthusiasm and reported that the ongoing series was becoming something of a national sensation. He wanted the wedding photograph. She sent him the porch portrait instead and told him the wedding was private, which he accepted with only minor complaint. Winter on the ridge was its own education. She learned to bank the fire at night and to read the weather the way Gideon read it, by the color of the western sky in the evening and the behavior of the horses and the direction of the wind. She learned which trails stayed passable in deep snow and which became impassable after the first heavy fall. She learned to snowshoe across the open meadows above the tree line, the two of them going out together on clear mornings when the sun turned the snow into fields of diamonds, and she photographed the winter country with the same intensity she had brought to it in summer, building a body of work that was seasonal and comprehensive, and unlike anything that had been done photographically in the high Rockies before. She also learned the rhythms of living beside Gideon Hunter in the specific intimacy of a small cabin in winter, which was a different education entirely. He was orderly and self-sufficient, and he snored very slightly when he was deeply asleep, which she found endearing in proportion to how much he would have hated knowing about it. He read in the evenings, mostly history and natural science and maps, and she wrote her dispatches and made notes on her photographs by the same firelight, and they talked in the easy, unhurried way of people who have time and inclination and are not afraid of silence. He was patient with her in the ways she needed patience, and did not make her feel that she needed it, which was a gift she had not expected to receive from anyone. When the cold got into her developing chemicals and ruined a batch of plates she had spent 2 days preparing, he sat with her while she was frustrated and did not offer empty comfort, just steady companionship, which was precisely what she needed. When she was working, really deeply working, he understood the quality of her absorption and gave it space, moving around her with a quiet consideration that she had previously found only in herself. She understood him, she thought, more clearly with every week. He was a man who had built a life from a specific vision of what a life should be, and who had been doing so alone for long enough that he had become, in some ways, more self-sufficient than was entirely good for a person. She was careful not to disrupt what was his, but to add to it, to bring to the ridge what only she could bring, which was the other half of a conversation that had been waiting for both of them. Spring came with a slowness that was painful, and then a speed that was startling. The snow retreating up the slopes, and the creek running high and loud, and the aspens leafing out in that particular pale gold-green of new leaves that was almost too beautiful to be real. She photographed the spring with the same dedication she had brought to every other season, the snowmelt and the early wildflowers and the wildlife emerging from its winter habits, and she and Gideon went back to the alpine lake in the bowl on the eastern face as soon as the pass was navigable, and she stood at the edge of the water and thought about the first time she had seen it, less than a year ago, and felt the full distance between who she had been then and who she was now. "What are you thinking?" Gideon asked from behind her. She turned. He was standing a few feet back with his hands in his coat pockets, watching her with that open, warm attention. "I am thinking that I have everything I wanted," she said, "and that I did not entirely know what I wanted until I had it." He came forward and put his arms around her from behind, his chin on the top of her head, both of them looking at the lake. "Good," he said. In the fall of 1883, a year after Jane had come back to the ridge, she told Gideon she was expecting a child. She told him over breakfast, because she was a direct person, and there was no better time for direct things than morning. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her for a long moment with an expression that moved through several things she could see clearly: surprise, then a kind of internal reckoning, then something that settled into a warmth so profound and genuine that it made her throat tight. "Are you well?" he asked first, which told her a great deal about him. "I am very well," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. He spent the next week reinforcing the cabin's insulation, with a thoroughness that suggested he was channeling something he did not entirely know how to express verbally, adding a second layer of chinking along the north wall, and installing a second hook for the pot over the fire so she would not have to bend as low. She photographed him doing this on a bright October afternoon, and the photograph that resulted was so quietly happy that she nearly wept over the developing tray, which she attributed to the pregnancy, and also to the fact that it was, simply, one of the most purely happy photographs she had ever taken. They welcomed their son in April of 1884, with Mrs. Hargrove's assistance, in the cabin on the ridge. He was born at dawn, which Jane always considered appropriate, and he was large from the beginning, in the way that suggested he had his father's constitution, and he had dark hair and gray-green eyes that looked, from the first day, as though they intended to take everything in. They named him William James Hunter, William for her father and James for no particular reason, except that it suited him. And Gideon held the baby in his enormous capable hands with the same careful gentleness he used with the horses and the injured animals he occasionally brought in from the mountain. And the expression on his face was one she had never seen before and could not have anticipated, something so open and new that she was looking at a version of him she had not known existed. She photographed them together, father and son, in the morning light of the cabin. It was the photograph that Horace Webb, when she sent him a copy 2 months later, called the finest portrait he had ever published. Life on the ridge settled into a new shape, denser and richer and louder, in the particular way that babies make things louder than what had come before. William Hunter proved to be a child of considerable personality from the earliest possible age, opinionated and curious and utterly fearless in ways that made both his parents alternately proud and alarmed. He was walking before his first birthday and attempting to follow his father on the shorter trail circuits by the time he was 18 months, toddling along in small boots that Gideon had made for him with a determination that was recognizably both of theirs. Jane continued her work throughout, adapting her photographic practice to the realities of motherhood with the same practical creativity she brought to everything. She worked in the early mornings and in the hours when William slept, and Gideon took their son on the longer circuits when Jane needed extended working time, carrying the child on his broad back in a carrier that Pete Alcott's mother had made for them. William falling asleep against his father's back in the mountain air, with a contentment that Jane photographed every time she could manage it. Horace Webb published the ongoing series under the title Life on the High Frontier, a continuing record, and the readership continued to grow. She received letters from across the country, from women especially, which she had not expected, women who wrote to tell her that her photographs had shown them something about the West that the usual depictions, the dime novels and the lurid adventure stories, had entirely failed to convey. She wrote back when she could, which was not always, but she kept the letters in a box on the shelf next to the drawing of the hawk. In the summer of 1886, William Hunter was 2 years old and already claiming that he wanted to be a trapper like his father when he grew up, a declaration that Gideon received with the greatest seriousness, and that Jane photographed his face making. They had a second child in November of 1886, a daughter they named Clara Me Hunter, who arrived with considerably less drama than her brother had, and who from the first days seemed to have a sunny and uncomplicated disposition that was a relief to both her parents. She had Jane's coloring, pale and light-haired, and she watched the world with an attention that Jane recognized with a mix of amusement and tenderness as specifically her own. The cabin had been extended by then, Gideon having spent the previous summer adding a second room onto the back with the help of a carpenter from Ridgecrest, because Jane had begun to feel that 2 adults and an increasingly mobile child in a single room was a situation that would need to resolve itself before the second child arrived. The new room was modest but solid, and they built a second bed in it and a small workspace for Jane's writing and records, and the cabin began to look, more and more, genuinely and fully inhabited in the way that homes are when people have lived in them long enough to make them theirs. Gideon began to teach Jane to track in those years, not because she needed to know for any practical reason, but because he wanted to share it and she was interested, which was always sufficient justification for both of them. She was an excellent student, which she attributed to the same visual attention that made her a good photographer, the ability to look at what was actually there rather than what she expected to see. He taught her the difference between the tracks of a mule deer and an elk, how to read the compression and scatter of snow to determine how recently and in what direction an animal had passed, how to move through the forest quietly, which was harder than it looked. She taught him in return to develop photographs, which he took to with the same focused attention he brought to all skills, and he became proficient enough that he could assist her in the darkroom during the phases of the process that were purely mechanical. He was a precise and patient assistant, which did not surprise her at all. She also taught him to write more, or rather she encouraged what was already there, the careful, sparse communication of a man with something genuine to say, and he began sending her occasional notes when she was in the darkroom or at her desk, small observations about what he had seen on the mountain that day, written in the same honest, unliterary style as his letters had been, and she kept every one of them in the same box as the letters from her readers. Pete Alcott, who had long since graduated from wrangler to having his own horse trading business in Ridgecrest, came up to the ridge one afternoon in the summer of 1887 with the news that a surveying party from the railroad had been through the valley, which meant the line was coming closer and the town was going to grow. He delivered this news with the particular expression of a man who understands that growth is complicated, that it brings things wanted and things not wanted in roughly equal measure. Gideon received the news without alarm. "The ridge will still be the ridge," he said. "They will want to buy the north slope," Pete said. "The copper." "They can want whatever they like," Gideon said. "The homestead claim covers it." Pete nodded and left, and Gideon went back to what he had been doing, which was repairing the corral fence with William, alongside him handing him nails with an expression of profound importance. Jane, who had been listening from the porch, watched them and felt something she would have described, if pressed, as the full and complete satisfaction of a life that had turned out to be exactly the right one. She went inside and developed the plates she had exposed that morning, working in the darkroom's red light with the careful efficiency of years of practice. And she watched Gideon's image come up in the developing bath in the way it had done hundreds of times by now, the familiar lines of him resolving from the gray. And she thought, as she thought every time, that the camera was right about him, that he was exactly as he appeared, strong and real and present and absolutely himself. She pinned the photograph up to dry next to the others on the line strung across the darkroom, and she went out to the porch and looked up at the mountain. And William came running across the clearing toward her with a fistful of pine cones, and Gideon came behind him at an unhurried walk, with the sun going gold across his shoulders. The feature that ran in Frank Leslie's that fall was the most comprehensive piece she had produced yet. 50 photographs selected from 5 years of work. The full arc of a life on the high frontier from summer through winter and back again. From the first tentative portraits of the cabin and the ridge to the family portraits she had taken that spring in the alpine meadows with both children and both horses, and the mountains enormous and patient above them all. Horace Webb called it the definitive visual record of the Western mountain man's way of life, which was accurate enough, though Jane privately thought it was something more specific than that. It was the record of one particular man on one particular mountain, and what happened when a woman came up that mountain with a camera and the intention to document something real, and found instead something she had not anticipated, which was the specific and irreplaceable realness of a person, a life, a place, and the way all three had rearranged themselves around each other until the distinctions between them were no longer entirely clear. The years moved on the ridge the way they moved everywhere, with change inside of continuity. William Hunter grew into a serious and capable boy who could track as well as his father by the time he was 8, and who had also, to everyone's satisfaction, inherited his mother's instinct for looking at things carefully, a combination that Gideon said made him a natural, and that Jane said was going to be interesting to raise. Clara Mee Hunter was cheerful and stubborn, and devoted to the horses in the corral with a passion that suggested she would be spending considerable time with them as she grew, a prediction that proved correct. Jane's body of work grew into something that occupied a recognized place in American photography. The Frontier series, syndicated to multiple publications, and discussed in the circles she had once inhabited in Philadelphia as something new and significant, work that combined the landscape tradition with a genuine documentary sensibility in ways that were being studied and imitated. She received letters from young photographers, women especially, asking how she had done it, how she had made a career in the West, how she had navigated a profession that was still largely hostile to women with cameras. She always wrote back honestly, because Gideon had taught her that honesty was the only useful form of communication, and she said, "Go where the real things are. Find the subject that demands your best attention, and do not be afraid of the large and obvious life when it presents itself to you, even if it does not look like what you expected." She did not write, "A mountain man will whistle a mountain lion away from you and lift you onto his horse in the rain, and hold your hand in both of his, and you will know with sudden, complete clarity that you have arrived exactly where you were always going." But that was also part of the answer. In the spring of 1890, Jane Winslow Hunter sat on the porch of the cabin that was now both smaller and larger than it had been when she first saw it. Smaller because the years had made it familiar in every detail, and larger because it held more life than it had then. The snow was retreating up the slopes for the 8th time she had watched it do so, and the aspens were coming into leaf below the ridge line, and the creek was running high, and somewhere inside the cabin Gideon was reading to Clara, his low voice carrying the cadences of a story through the open window with a warmth and patience that still, after all these years, caught her off guard in its generosity. William came up the path from the barn with the easy long stride that was already, at 6 years old, beginning to look like his father's, and he stopped at the porch steps and looked up at her with those gray-green eyes. "Mama," he said, "I want to learn to photograph." She looked at him for a moment, this child who was so precisely half of each of them, Gideon's directness and her curiosity, both their stubbornness, and she thought about the telegram that had arrived on a Tuesday morning in Philadelphia and the train west and the mountain, and the man who had come off the boulder and held out his hand and said simply, "Come on then." "All right," she said. "I will teach you." She stood up from the porch chair and went inside to find her smallest camera, the one that was easier to handle, and she heard Gideon's voice stop in the middle of a sentence, and then she heard Clara's voice say something, and then Gideon laughed, that low, real laugh that was still the sound she liked best in the world, and she stood in the doorway for a moment with the camera in her hands and looked at them all. Her husband and her daughter with a picture book between them in the firelight of the cabin on the ridge that looked out over the mountains. She was looking at the thing that she had come west to find, though she had not known then that this was what she was looking for. She had come to photograph the frontier. She had found, instead, the specific and irreplaceable bones of her own life, and they were exactly right. She went back out to the porch where William was waiting with his father's patience and her determination, and she put the camera in his hands and showed him how to hold it. "Look through here," she said. He pressed his face to the viewfinder and went quiet in the way that meant he was really looking, and she stood beside him in the mountain morning with the ridge and the sky and the wide and permanent country all around them, and she thought, yes, this is exactly right. This is where we are, and this is who we are, and everything that needed to happen has happened, and everything that matters is here. Inside, Gideon Hunter closed the picture book and lifted Clara onto his shoulder and came to the doorway, leaning his broad shoulder against the frame with the easy physical certainty of a man completely comfortable in his world. He looked at Jane and then at William with the camera, and something in his face did what it always did when he looked at the two of them, went quiet and open and warm in that way she had first seen 6 years ago in a hotel doorway when she had come back from Philadelphia. "He has your eye," Gideon said. "He has yours," Jane said. Their son lowered the camera and looked out at the mountain with an expression that was so specifically itself, so completely its own new thing, that Jane reached for the camera and gently took it back. "May I?" she asked William. He nodded with great seriousness. She raised the camera and looked through the viewfinder, and there they were, Gideon in the doorway with Clara laughing on his shoulder, William in the foreground with the mountain behind him and the whole enormous Colorado sky above, the cabin at the edge of the frame, the aspens pale gold green in the new morning light. She squeezed the release. The shutter snapped. She had her photograph.